All right, let's start with application properties. So in this demo, I'm going to work with this main page that you can find attached to this lecture as well. If you run this application, you get something like this. So we have a very basic form with an entry cell and a switch cell. Now we want to add persistence to this application. So at some point, we should store the value of these settings. And when the page is loaded, we want to restore the settings. But at which point should we store these settings? Well, we have a few options, and that really depends on the type of application you're building. You could have a button here on the page called Done or Save or Complete, and when the user taps that button, we can store the settings. But for settings pages, this approach is not common. At least in iOS, we don't have a save button here. It's not a common approach. Another approach is to handle the change event of each of these input fields, and as the value of the input field changes, we can store it immediately. Now, this can be a good thing, it can be a bad thing. The good thing about this approach is that we store the values as soon as they are changed. So if the application crashes unexpectedly, we cause the least inconvenience to the user. But the bad thing about this approach is that if you have a page with a lot of settings, handling the change event of each of these settings is going to bring a lot of noise in your code. A third option is to store the settings when the user navigates away from this page. So most applications have more than one page, and settings page is a completely separate page. So the user navigates to the settings page and then navigates back to wherever they came from. So this is the time we can store these settings. Now let me show you both these approaches. Back in our XAML file, first I want to handle the change event of each of these cells. So for the entry cell, it's going to be completed event. Handle completed. And for the switch cell, it's going to be on changed. So currently we have two event handlers, and as we add more settings to this page, this class is going to get bloated with code. Now, one way to clean this up is to use the same handler for all these input fields. So I'm going to rename this handle underline completed to on change. And remove the other handler. So this onChange is a standard event handler. It takes an object and an event args. And we can use this as a handler for all kinds of events. So back in our XAML file, I'm going to change both these handler names to onChange. So it's a little bit cleaner, but still in our XAML file, we have to handle the change event for each input field. Now, inside this method, we use application.current, which returns an instance of the current application object, .properties. This is our dictionary. So here we can put name. And for our entry cell, we have an X name called title. So we can set title.text here. Now let's duplicate. For the other setting, I'm going to use notifications enabled. And here we add notifications enabled dot on property. So that's for the switch cell. So this is how we store these properties. And by the way, these properties are not stored immediately. Persistence happens when the application goes in the sleep mode. And this happens either when we switch to a different application. So this application goes in the background and another application comes to the foreground. So in that case, our application goes into sleep mode. Another occasion is when we quit this application. Again, application goes into sleep and the properties get stored. When we launch the application again or bring it to the foreground, then the application wakes up and our properties are available for reading. If you want to enforce persistence of these properties, you can use application.current.saveProperties async method. So this way, you don't have to wait until the application goes into sleep mode. And this is useful in applications where the user types a long text like notes, email, messages, and so on. So in these situations, you may want to store this transient data as soon as possible. In that case, you can call saveProperties async method. Now in this demo, we don't need this, so I'm going to delete it. All right, so we implemented storing of the properties. Now currently we're using onChange event handler. Earlier I told you that we can also store these settings when the user navigates away from this page. For that, we can override onDisappearing method of the page class. So when the user navigates away from this page, this method is called. And this is a chance for you to store these properties. But I'm not going to use this approach in this demo because we have a single page and this method is never called. But remember it if you need it in your applications. So this is all about saving the properties. Now let's work on loading. So in the constructor, when the page is loaded, we want to restore these settings. So we should do the reverse of what we have done in onChange event. So I'm going to copy this expression here and then add title.text equals this expression. Now this properties returns an object, so we need to call toString method here. And also, the first time we launch the application, we don't have an item with this key in our dictionary. So we need to check for that. So if application.current.properties that contains key of name, then we set title.text. Now I'm going to repeat this for the other property. If application.current.properties that contains key of notifications enabled, we set notifications enabled.on to this expression. And again, because this returns an object, we need to explicitly cast it to bool, like this. So this is how we save or load settings using application properties. By the way, this is not the way I recommend you to use application properties. First, I want you to understand how everything works exactly under the hood. And then in the next lecture, I will show you a cleaner and more maintainable way to use application properties. Now let's run the application and see what happens. All right, so I'm going to add shopping here and enable notifications. Now I want to put the application in the sleep mode. And that happens when we switch to a different application or quit this application. For this demo, I'm going to quit the application. So when we launch it again, we can verify that the settings are stored. So in iOS Simulator, here in the hardware menu on the top, we have this menu item, Home. Look at the shortcut, Shift, Command, and H. If you're using Android or Windows, you should have a different way to quit your application. So whatever that is, let's try it. So in iOS, I'm going to hold down Shift, Command, and press H twice. Now I'm going to swipe this to top to quit the application. Let's launch it again. Beautiful. Our settings are stored and loaded properly. Now, in the next lecture, I'm going to show you a cleaner way to use application properties.